My wife sent me a text at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. 7 words. Don't come home tonight. I need space. I was sitting in the parking garage of a Marriott on South Tryon Street in Charlotte, still in my suit, still holding the Thai takeout I'd grabbed because I thought she might be hungry. The food was getting cold. I read the message 3 times. Then I typed back 1 word. Okay. And I drove to the hotel, checked in, set an alarm for 5:30, and lay on top of the covers staring at the ceiling because I already knew something she didn't. Something I'd known for exactly 11 days. The next morning, while Renata was still asleep in the house we'd built together in the Dilworth neighborhood of Charlotte, a listing went live on Zillow. Professional photos, 6 figures over asking. Full description, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, original hardwood floors, the pergola I'd built with my own hands the summer we moved in. She called me 47 times before 9 a.m. I answered on the 48th. Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to something you've been through, or someone you know, hit subscribe right now. Leave a comment below and tell me, what's the one moment you knew everything was about to change? I read every single one. And hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. My name is Holden Crest. I'm 44 years old. I'm a real estate attorney in Charlotte, North Carolina, which means I know more about property law, deed transfers, and listing agreements than most people ever want to. I've spent 17 years reviewing contracts, closing transactions, and advising clients on what they own, what they owe, and what they're entitled to when a marriage falls apart. I never thought I'd need that knowledge for myself. For 12 years, I was the kind of husband who thought effort was enough. I worked hard. I came home. I showed up to things. We went on vacations to Asheville and once to Portugal for our 10th anniversary, and I thought that was what love looked like in the long run. Presence, consistency, a man who didn't disappear. Renata ran her own interior design business out of a studio near South End, and she was good at it, genuinely talented. The kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately see what it was supposed to become. She had opinions about everything. Paint colors, light fixtures, the exact angle of a sofa against a window. And I found it charming for 9 out of our 12 years together. The house in Dilworth was hers in spirit, even if both our names were on the deed. She'd designed every inch of it. The built-in bookshelves in the study. The kitchen island she'd had custom made from a slab of Brazilian quartzite. The master bathroom with the freestanding tub that cost more than my first car. I'd written the checks and asked almost no questions, because watching her bring that house to life made her happy in a way I didn't fully understand, but was grateful to witness. We didn't have children. That was a choice we'd made together in our early 30s, or at least I thought we'd made it together. Renata had been firm about it. She said her work was her calling, that she couldn't give both a child and her clients what they deserved. I'd accepted that. I told myself I accepted it. Looking back, I wonder how many things I'd accepted that I hadn't really examined. The first time something felt wrong, I dismissed it as stress. That was September, about 14 months before the night of the text. Renata had landed a major contract, a boutique hotel renovation in Noda, the arts district north of uptown Charlotte. It was the biggest project of her career. She was excited in a way I hadn't seen in years, almost electric with it, working late, taking calls at odd hours, texting constantly. I told myself that was what success looked like for her. I told myself I was proud of her. She started going to the office on Saturdays, then Sundays. She stopped asking about my cases, which had always been our dinner table ritual. Me explaining some obscure corner of property law, her listening with genuine curiosity, asking questions that surprised me with their sharpness. That stopped. I told myself we were both busy. I told myself this was temporary. Then in November, I noticed she'd changed her phone passcode. She'd had the same 4 digits since the year we got married. I noticed the change because I'd picked up her phone to look at a photo she'd taken at a client's house, and my muscle memory went to type the old code, and it didn't work. She was in the kitchen. I set the phone down and said nothing. That was when I started paying attention. I'm not a dramatic person. I didn't hire a private investigator. I didn't go through her purse or follow her car. I'm an attorney. I think in terms of evidence, and I knew enough to know that emotional suspicion isn't evidence. What I did was quieter than that. I started observing with the same detachment I applied to cases. I watched patterns. I noted discrepancies. And I let time do what time always does: reveal. The hotel renovation project brought a man named Sullivan Price into our orbit. He was the lead architect on the NODA project, a 40-year-old from Denver who'd relocated to Charlotte 2 years earlier. I met him exactly once, at a project kickoff dinner at a restaurant on North Davidson Street in December. He was tall, soft-spoken, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had a door closed in his face. He called Renata by a nickname I'd never heard her use. She laughed at things he said before he finished saying them. I shook his hand and drove us home, and said nothing. In January, I found a receipt in Renata's coat pocket while I was bringing her jacket to the dry cleaner. A restaurant on Park Road. A Saturday afternoon. 2 orders of food. 1 bottle of wine. Renata had told me that Saturday she was at a design consultation in Ballantine. I stood in our kitchen holding that receipt for a long time. And then I did what any reasonable, methodical person does when they believe the foundation of their life may be cracking. I started making preparations. Not out of anger, not out of vengeance, out of something much colder. The quiet, practiced instinct of a man who has spent his entire career protecting people from what happens when agreements fall apart. Here's something most people don't know about real estate law in North Carolina. Marital property is equitable distribution, not equal distribution. That's not a technicality. It's everything. It means a court doesn't split assets down the middle automatically. It weighs contributions, circumstances, economic fault. It means that a spouse who has been financing a home, maintaining a home, and holding the primary professional equity in a household is not automatically going to lose half of everything. I knew all of this. I'd advised clients on exactly these dynamics dozens of times. I knew what had to happen before any formal proceedings began. I knew which conversations to have and when to have them and, crucially, which ones to not have yet. I said nothing to Renata. I called my colleague Petra Nakamura at her firm on East Trade Street. Petra handles domestic litigation, specifically high-asset divorces. I'd referred clients to her for a decade. I explained the situation in the same flat, organized tone I use for every professional call. She asked me 3 questions. I answered them. She said, "Come see me on Thursday." I did. The meeting with Petra lasted 2 hours. She explained my position. She explained what documentation I would need. She explained what a strategic first move might look like. And then she said something I already knew, but needed to hear from another attorney. "Whatever you do, Holden, don't confront her until you're ready, because the moment she knows you know, the clock starts running." I was not ready yet. I needed 11 more days. Those 11 days were the strangest of my life. I went to work. I reviewed title searches and prepared deed transfers and attended a closing for a development on the South Park side of Charlotte that I'd been managing for 18 months. I came home to a house that still smelled like Renata's candles, and still had her design magazines stacked on the coffee table, and still had her voice moving through the rooms. I ate dinner with my wife. I asked about her day. She asked about mine. We watched television in the same room. I have never felt more alone in my life, and I have never been more controlled. Because here is what I knew by the time those 11 days began. I knew the house in Dilworth was purchased entirely with my premarital capital and joint savings I could document. I knew Renata's design business, while successful, operated at a loss for the first 4 years of our marriage and had been partially subsidized by household income that I generated. I knew that my name was first on the mortgage and that the property had appreciated by nearly 60% since we bought it. And I knew that under North Carolina equitable distribution, economic misconduct, including marital fault, is an admissible consideration. I also knew something else, something more immediate, something that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the specific mathematics of what she was about to do. Renata had been telling people we were fine, her clients, her friends, her mother in Greensboro. I knew this because her closest friend, a woman named Darcy who'd been at our wedding and who had always liked me genuinely and separately from Renata, had texted me in February asking if everything was okay. She'd said Renata seemed distracted. She'd said something felt off. Darcy didn't know what she was telling me. She just thought she was checking in. I told Darcy everything was fine, and I kept watching. The text came on a Tuesday. March. A cold night for Charlotte, which is to say it was 48 degrees and felt Arctic by local standards. I had worked late. I'd stopped at a Thai place on Central Avenue. I was in the parking garage of my office building when the message arrived. Don't come home tonight. I need space. 7 words. No punctuation on the second sentence. The kind of message you send when you've been rehearsing it. Okay. I drove to the Marriott on South Tryon. I had already spoken with Petra that afternoon. Not about the text, because I didn't know it was coming, but about finalized next steps. The listing was already prepared. I had already retained the photographer 3 days earlier. I had already spoken to the listing agent, a colleague named Grant Whitfield from a firm on Providence Road, and explained the situation in careful, measured terms. Grant was discreet and professional and had been in residential real estate in Charlotte for 20 years. He understood how to move quietly. The listing was ready to go live the moment I authorized it. From a king bed in that Marriott, with the blinds open and the Charlotte skyline faint through the glass, I sent Grant one text. Go ahead. And then I set an alarm. And I lay there. And I did not sleep. Before I tell you what happened that morning, I need to tell you something about the 11 days before it, because those days matter in a way I didn't fully understand while I was living them. Those 11 days were not the beginning of anything. They were the last stage of something that had been ending for longer than I wanted to admit. Longer, I think, than Renata and I had been willing to name together. Marriages don't fail in a moment. They fail across 100 small moments that each look like something else. A conversation that gets shorter than it used to be. A silence that stops being companionable and starts being careful. A habit of not asking certain questions, because asking would require answering them too. That slow erosion had been happening in our house on Matilda Avenue in Dilworth for at least 2 years, maybe longer. I know that now. I didn't know it clearly while it was happening because I was too close to it and too committed to the version of our life that I believed in. I had built a good life. I wanted to believe it was a shared one. The 11 days were the days between when I first understood that it wasn't shared, not the way I needed it to be, and when I was ready to act. I don't use the word act lightly. I mean it precisely. I needed to act from a position of clarity, not reaction. I needed to make decisions I could stand behind 3 years from then, 5 years from then. I needed to be the man I'd trained myself to be, even when every instinct was pulling toward something rawer and more destructive. So I prepared, and I waited. And then she sent me a text at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and the waiting was over. Let me explain something about what it feels like to be the methodical one. People assume that when someone handles a crisis calmly, they don't feel it. That's not true. I felt every inch of that night. I thought about the way Renata had laughed the first time I brought her to look at the Dilworth house, standing in the empty living room pointing at the crown molding, telling me what she saw there. I thought about our 10-year anniversary dinner on a terrace in Lisbon, the way the light came across the river, the way she'd looked at me across a table and said she couldn't imagine another life. I thought about last Christmas, which had been good, genuinely good, with her family in Greensboro, the kind of holiday that feels solid. I thought, was any of it real? Or was I the only one who was really in it? And then the alarm went off, and I got up, and I put on my suit, and I became an attorney again. Her first call came in at 7:12 a.m. I was in the hotel restaurant with a cup of coffee and a legal brief I wasn't reading. I watched my phone light up. Renata. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 7:14, and 7:17, and 4 more times before 7:30. I'd expected her to see the listing because I knew how she moved through the internet in the mornings. She set Google alerts for properties in our neighborhood, had done it for years. Kept tabs on what her competitors were designing in comparable homes. The Zillow notification would have landed automatically. Professional photos. 6 figures. The interior she had designed with her own hands, presented to strangers as a commodity. I can only imagine what that felt like. And I want to be honest with you. There was no satisfaction in that imagining. Only a terrible, hollow kind of clarity. By the 9th call, the voicemails had started. I didn't listen to them until that afternoon. In order, they moved through. Confusion, then anger, then something close to panic, then a register I hadn't heard from her in years, something raw and real and frightened. By the 20th call, the messages were quieter. By the 30th, she stopped leaving them. She called 47 times. On the 48th, I answered. Holden. Her voice was rough. She'd been crying. I knew the specific sound of Renata crying. It was something I'd heard maybe 6 or 7 times in 12 years, because she was not a person who cried easily, and each time had felt like a rupture in the atmosphere. This was that sound. Holden, what did you do? I listed the house, I said. Grant Whitfield has the listing. He's expecting interest this week. The market in Dilworth is strong right now. You can't just... Holden, this is my house. Both our names are on the deed, I said. But I think you know the financials better than that. Silence. Then, you knew. You've known. For a while, I said. Another silence. The kind that has weight to it. Why didn't you say anything? Because I needed to be ready, I said. And you sent me a text at 11 o'clock telling me not to come home. So I figured the conversation could start in the morning. She didn't say anything for a long time. I heard her breathing. I heard, very faintly, the sound of the house, the creak that the third step always made, which meant she was moving through the rooms, moving through a house that now had a listing number attached to it. Where are you? She finally asked. I have an office, I said. I'll stay at the Marriott until we have a legal framework in place. Petra Nakamura is handling my side of things. I'd recommend you call someone today. Petra Naka. You already have a lawyer? I'm an attorney, Renata. I've been one for 17 years. I paused. I'll have Grant send over the listing details. You should know what's in the market materials. She made a sound I didn't quite have a name for. Not a word, just a sound. And then she said, Holden, I made a mistake. I know, I said. So did I. Several, over a long time. We can talk about all of them, but not today. Not until there's a framework. I ended the call. My hands were completely steady. I have no explanation for why, other than that I had spent 3 months preparing for that moment, and preparation is the only thing I know how to do with fear. The days that followed were not neat. I want to be honest about that. There is a version of this story where the methodical man is never rattled, where the attorney who anticipated everything sails through the collapse of his marriage without taking damage. That's not this story. I moved into a furnished apartment on the 9th floor of a building on Moorhead Street in uptown Charlotte. The apartment had white walls and someone else's leftover furniture in the closet, and a view of the city that was technically impressive and felt like looking at someone else's life. I ordered groceries online for the first week, because I didn't know how to be a person who went to a grocery store alone. I had learned over 12 years of marriage to make accommodations for 2 people in every domestic act. How much coffee? What to keep in the refrigerator? How many towels? All of that knowledge turned out to be useless now and strangely difficult to unlearn. I called my brother, Fletcher, who lives outside of Denver, and I told him the outline of what had happened. Fletcher is 3 years older than me and has been married to his college girlfriend for 20 years and handles everything with a kind of steady humor that I have always envied. He listened without interrupting, which is the thing about Fletcher. He never interrupts. When I finished, he said, "You sound like you're holding up better than you are." Probably, I said. The house listing thing was bold. It was strategic, I said. Holden, he said gently. I know, but it was also a little bold. I say that with love. I appreciated that more than I told him. My father called when he heard, because Fletcher called him first, which Fletcher always does. My father is 71 and lives in a house outside of Raleigh that he has occupied for 38 years, and he has opinions about most things, including my marriage, which he had never fully expressed while Renata and I were together, but which now emerged with the careful freedom of hindsight. He said, "I always thought you were more in love with her than she was with you." I didn't tell him he might be right. I thanked him and told him I'd come to Raleigh soon. At the office, I told my partner and closest colleague, a man named Davis Okafor, who had known me since law school, and who responded to the news with exactly the kind of measured concern I expected from him. Practical, forward-looking, checking in without hovering. Davis knew the general shape of things because I'd needed to tell someone in the building, that my home situation was in flux. He never made it dramatic. I was grateful every day for that. Here is what happened next, and I'm going to tell it clearly, because I think people deserve clarity on this point. The legal process was not swift. It was not clean. It was the single most exhausting professional experience of my life. And I say this as someone who has litigated complex real estate disputes across 3 jurisdictions. Renata retained an attorney named Philip Boggs, who practices out of a firm on College Street and who is competent and aggressive, and exactly the kind of adversary I would have respected in any other context. The negotiation over the house was the first battle. She argued, through Boggs, that her design contributions to the property had created a form of intangible equity beyond the deed. Petra pushed back with the financial documentation I'd prepared, the purchase history, the renovation invoices, the years of household income records. It was an argument I expected to win, and I did win it, though it took 5 months and cost both of us in ways that weren't only financial. The Zillow listing sat active for 31 days before I authorized Grant to accept an offer. The buyers were a couple from Raleigh relocating to Charlotte, mid-30s, first home purchase in the city, delighted by the pergola. I signed the paperwork in Petra's conference room on a Friday afternoon in April, and then sat in my car outside her building for 20 minutes doing nothing in particular. The house sold for more than we paid for it, which is what happens in Dilworth when you hold long enough. After legal costs and equitable settlement, I came out ahead financially. That felt important to say, not as a victory. It wasn't a victory, but as a fact. I had protected what I built. That had been the point. Sullivan Price, for what it's worth, left Charlotte 4 months after everything came to light. The Noda Hotel renovation was reassigned to a different architectural firm. Renata lost the contract. I found out through professional channels, not because I was looking for that information, but because Charlotte's design and real estate world is not large, and news moves through it. I did not feel satisfaction about any of that. I felt tired. There's a question I've been asked by almost everyone who learned what happened. Why didn't you just talk to her? Why didn't you confront her when you knew? It's a fair question. Let me try to answer it honestly. I've been thinking about it since March, which means I've had months with it now. And the truest thing I can tell you is that confrontation in that moment would have been for me. For my anger, for my need to be heard, for the relief of making the secret visible. And confrontation without preparation would have cost me everything I spent years building. I know this because I've watched it happen to clients. The husband who calls his wife out at the dinner table and then, 2 weeks later, finds himself in a negotiation where he has no documented position. The wife who gives the marriage one more chance out of love, and then 18 months later, sits across from me with nothing but hope and a joint account. I didn't confront Renata because I loved her, in whatever way was still functional, enough to not destroy my own position in the process. That might not sound romantic. I know it doesn't, but it's true. And if I'm being fully honest, a part of me didn't confront her because I was afraid of what she'd say. Afraid she'd explain something I couldn't unfeel. Afraid she'd tell me that she hadn't been happy for longer than I knew, that I'd missed it, that all the presence and consistency and effort I thought I was giving wasn't what she needed. That fear was real. It ran underneath all the strategy. It still does. I want to tell you something about the specific texture of those negotiations, because I think people have a sanitized idea of what it looks like when a marriage ends through legal channels rather than through an argument in a kitchen. Petra and Philip Boggs circled each other for months with the deliberate patience of people who are very good at their jobs and who know that neither side wins by moving recklessly. There were depositions. There was financial disclosure I had to provide that laid bare every decision I'd made over 12 years. Where money came from, where it went, how the household had been structured. I found the disclosure process oddly cathartic, like being asked to narrate your own life in chronological order, except that every chapter was assigned a dollar figure. It clarified things. I had contributed more than I'd realized, financially, emotionally, in every category that a court considers relevant. That wasn't vindication, it was just information. But information, in law and in life, is not nothing. Renata's financial position was more precarious than I'd understood while we were together. The design business, which had been her pride and her identity, was carrying debt from a studio expansion she'd undertaken 2 years earlier. The Noda hotel contract had represented, for her, not just creative opportunity, but financial survival. When she lost it, the impact was significant. I learned about this through the discovery process, which is a cold way to learn about the vulnerability of someone you once loved. I had Petra communicate through Boggs that I had no interest in pursuing any claim against her business. I wanted the house settled and the marriage dissolved. I didn't want her destroyed. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. The settlement came in May. The house sale proceeds were divided according to the financial documentation Petra had built. Renata received a portion that acknowledged her years of contribution to the household in the only way a legal framework knows how to acknowledge it, as a number. I received the majority, which reflects a financial reality, not a moral one. I don't conflate the two. We signed the final documents on a Wednesday afternoon. Renata and I were not in the same room for it. That was our respective attorney's recommendation, and I agreed with it. There was nothing useful to be said at that table that hadn't already been said through briefs and counter-motions and the slow, expensive machinery of divorce law. I signed my copies. Petra witnessed. And that was that. I drove back to the apartment on Moorhead Street and ordered pizza from a place on Tryon and watched a baseball game I don't remember the outcome of. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel grief exactly. I felt like someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time had finally exhaled and now had to remember how to breathe normally again. The apartment on Moorhead Street became something I didn't expect. A life. Not a substitute for the life I'd lost. A different one. Quieter in some ways. Louder in others. I started cooking in a deliberate way for the first time in years, because it turned out I had opinions about food that had been quietly subordinated to Renata's opinions for over a decade. I started running along the Greenway near South End on weekend mornings, which I hadn't done since my late 30s. I started sleeping in the center of the bed, which sounds like a small thing and is, in fact, enormous. My brother Fletcher visited in June. We went to a Hornets preseason game at Spectrum Center and ate at a barbecue place on Brookshire Freeway that Fletcher declared the best he'd ever had, which is the kind of thing Fletcher always says. He looked around my apartment while I was making coffee and said, "This is actually pretty good, Holden." And I said, "It is." And I meant it. Davis and I took on a major commercial litigation case in early summer, a land use dispute involving a development on the eastern edge of Mecklenburg County that was going to require serious focus over the next year. I was glad for the complexity. I needed something that required the whole of my mind. I didn't date, I wasn't interested, and I wasn't ready. Some people, after a marriage ends, seem to need another person immediately to prove something or to fill the specific shape of what's gone. I didn't feel that. I felt like I needed to know who I was in a room by myself before I had any business being in a room with someone else. Renata called me in July. Not through the attorneys. Directly. My personal cell, the number she'd had since we were dating. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. She said, "I want to apologize. Properly. Not through Philip. Not as part of a settlement. Just to you." I said, "Okay." She talked for a while. She talked about how she'd felt the marriage narrowing over the last few years, how she'd felt herself disappearing into the aesthetic of a life we'd built instead of the substance of it, how Sullivan Price had been an escape that she'd mistaken for a solution. She said she was ashamed. She said the word ashamed clearly, without softening it. She said she knew she'd made choices that were wrong by any measure, including her own, and she was sorry for them. She said, "I think I knew, somewhere, that you knew, before the text. I think I sent that message because I needed something to happen. I needed someone to do something." I said, "I can't tell you whether that makes it better or worse." She said, "I know." There was a long silence, the kind that had weight to it, the kind that meant something was finished. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked. "I am," I said. "I think I already am, mostly. Are you?" She said, "I'm working on it." I believed her. That's the honest answer. I believed that Renata was trying to become something she'd failed to be inside our marriage, and I hoped she'd get there. I did not want her to be destroyed. I had never wanted that. What I wanted was to survive and to come out intact, and I had done that. I told her to take care of herself. She told me the same, and that was, mostly, the end of the conversation that our marriage had been postponing for 2 years. There is a woman in my office building. Her name is Ren. She's a litigator at a firm 2 floors up, who knew Renata and me socially, the way people in the same professional orbit know each other. We'd seen each other at firm events, legal association dinners, that sort of thing. After word got around about the divorce, Ren sent me a message that said only, "I heard. I'm sorry. Let me know if you want to grab coffee sometime." I waited 3 weeks and then I said yes. We've had coffee 4 times. She's sharp and funny and has strong opinions about case law and bad opinions about coffee, which she takes with an amount of sugar that concerns me professionally. She asked me once, over terrible coffee in the building lobby, whether the thing with the Zillow listing was planned or impulsive. I told her planned. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "That is the most attorney thing I have ever heard." I said, "Is that a compliment?" She said, "It's an observation." I decided to take it as a compliment. I don't know what Ren is or will be. I'm not in a place to know that yet, and she seems to understand that, which is its own kind of relief. But the coffee is good for me in a way I didn't anticipate. A reminder that the world outside of what ended is still moving, still full of people who are interesting and complicated and worth knowing. There's something I want to say directly because I think it matters. A lot of people have asked me, friends, colleagues, Fletcher, even my father, whether what I did was right, whether listing the house without warning was fair, whether the methodical approach, the preparation, the strategic silence was ethical. My honest answer is, I don't know if it was right. I know it was legal. I know it was effective. I know it protected me from a negotiation I would have entered from a position of emotional devastation if I'd confronted her in February instead of March. I know that in a divorce, especially one involving a property dispute, being prepared is the difference between security and ruin. But I also know that Renata woke up to find her home on Zillow. I know what that must have felt like. And I know that there is a version of this story where I could have handled it differently. Sat down, said what I knew, had the hard conversation months earlier, and let the legal process begin from a place of mutual acknowledgement rather than strategic surprise. I didn't make that choice. I'm not certain I made the better one. I made the choice I was capable of making in the situation I was in, which is the only honest thing anyone can say about their own decisions. What I do know is this. I didn't lie. I didn't destroy anything that wasn't already broken. I protected what I'd spent my adult life building, and I got up on the other side. The apartment on Moorhead is mine now. I signed a proper lease in August, got rid of the leftover furniture, bought a couch that I picked out alone, and that fits the room correctly, and that no one has opinions about but me. I have a bookshelf in the study that's full of the books I actually want, not the ones that look good in a designed space. I have a kitchen where I make coffee the way I like it. Last week I drove through Dilworth. I hadn't done that since the sale closed. I took the long way down East Boulevard, past the blocks I'd walked for 12 years, past the coffee shop where Renata and I used to go on Sunday mornings, past the cross street where you can see the roof of the house we used to own. I slowed down without intending to. The new owners have a bicycle hanging on the front porch, a wreath on the door. There's a light on in the room Renata used as her home office. Somebody's life, moving through the rooms of a house I know by heart. I drove on. Fletcher asked me on his last visit whether I'd learned anything. I told him that felt like a big question for a parking lot. He said, "You're always in a parking lot when things happen to you." He's right about that. What I've learned is harder to summarize than a lesson. I've learned that being present in a marriage is not the same as being known inside one. That consistency can become a kind of invisible wall. You're so reliably there that no one bothers to tell you what they need, because asking would be a disruption, and disruption is impolite when things are fine. I was fine, for years. I thought we were fine. Renata was disappearing inside the fineness of our life, and I was too comfortable to notice, or too afraid of what noticing might cost. I've learned that preparation is not the same as protection. I prepared for the legal and financial realities of the end of my marriage, with more thoroughness than I've applied to almost any professional challenge, and it helped. And it also did not protect me from lying in a hotel room at 11 o'clock at night, holding a bag of Thai food, and wondering where the last 12 years went. I've learned that the right move and the brave move are not always the same move, and that knowing the difference is the work of a lifetime. If you've been in a room like the one I was in, not literally, but the room where you're trying to hold yourself together while everything you built shakes around you, I hope this was worth your time. I'm not here to tell you I did everything right. I did what I could with what I had, which is all any of us ever do. But I came out the other side. I sleep in the center of the bed. I make coffee the way I like it. I drive through Dilworth sometimes, and I keep going. The 48 calls, the one word, the listing on Zillow. I would do some of it differently. I would not pretend otherwise. But I would not have stayed in a marriage that was already gone just because leaving required a harder kind of courage than staying. Thank you for listening to this. You know what hit me hardest about this story? It wasn't the Zillow thing. It wasn't the 47 calls. It was the idea that someone can be present in a marriage for years and still be completely invisible to the person right next to them. That's the quiet kind of lonely nobody talks about. And honestly, I think a lot of people watching this right now know exactly what that feels like. If this story touched something real for you, drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time.